On May 2nd, 2017, in Cullman, Alabama, just before 11 p.m., a call came into emergency services. A man spoke in a remarkably calm voice. He told the dispatcher that his wife had just taken her own life inside her vehicle, parked right outside their home. Patrol deputies arrived within minutes. Sitting behind the wheel of the SUV was 32-year-old Tiffany Crawford. She had suffered 2 gunshot wounds to the head, and a .38 caliber revolver was resting in her left hand. After a quick examination of the vehicle, local investigators initially classified the case as an apparent self-inflicted death. At first glance, it looked like another routine case that would quickly disappear into the daily crime reports. But I want you to take a closer look at what actually happened that night. First, Tiffany was unquestionably right-handed. So how did a heavy revolver end up in her non-dominant hand? Second, firing 2 shots into your own head is extraordinarily difficult from a physical standpoint. But the most baffling part of this story wasn't inside the SUV at all. Before state investigators even made it to the scene, Tiffany's mother-in-law arrived. Coincidentally, she worked at the local sheriff's office. And do you know what decision the Cullman authorities made that night? They never impounded the SUV as primary evidence. Instead, officers handed the keys over to Jason's family. The very next morning, while a state investigator was still on the way to obtain a search warrant, Jason's relatives showed up with buckets of water and cleaning supplies. They carefully scrubbed the interior, removing every trace of blood before forensic specialists ever had the opportunity to process the vehicle. Have you ever heard of law enforcement allowing a family to deep clean the primary crime scene before forensic investigators arrived? To me, that raises some serious questions. What disappeared along with everything they washed away? And why did local authorities allow it to happen without stepping in? To answer those questions, we have to go back several years and look at everything that led up to that night. To understand who may have wanted Tiffany out of the picture, we need to rewind 4 years. In 2013, she started a local support group called Mothers Helping Mothers. By early 2017, the community had grown to more than 8,300 active members. Tiffany was raising her son Tristan and her daughter Symphony, constantly organizing community events, and, from the outside, appeared to have built the kind of life many people admired. It looked like everything was going exactly as planned. But that image was far more fragile than anyone realized. The reality behind the bedroom door was completely different. Her husband's chronic emotional detachment pushed Tiffany toward a risky decision. She began a secret relationship with a man named Kyle Sunday. And that's when one detail buried in the case file immediately stands out. At one point, Tiffany intentionally pressed a hot curling iron against her own neck, leaving herself with a burn. Why would anyone do that? The answer was surprisingly practical. She needed to hide the fresh marks her boyfriend had left before her husband noticed them. Life inside that house had turned into a constant exercise in covering things up. During the winter of late 2016 and early 2017, her father-in-law gave her the same .38 caliber revolver as a gift for personal protection. She immediately enrolled in a certified firearms safety course. Later, her instructor, James Curtis, gave testimony that completely undermined the original police theory. He explained that Tiffany always fired with a 2-handed grip. She never practiced shooting one-handed, especially not with her non-dominant left hand. In the spring of 2017, Kyle unexpectedly ended the relationship. But instead of falling apart, Tiffany made a deliberate and practical decision. She took a job as a cashier at a local grocery store. Her plan was straightforward: save enough money, quietly file for divorce, move out, and begin an independent life on her own terms. On May 1st, exactly 24 hours before her body was discovered, Tiffany met with licensed psychotherapist Laura Doss. The therapist completed a full evaluation of her emotional well-being. The official clinical assessment was clear. Tiffany was looking ahead with confidence, intended to work through her problems one step at a time, and showed absolutely no signs of wanting to take her own life. As I went through those records, I couldn't help questioning the conclusions reached by the first responding deputies. They were looking at a determined mother who was saving money for a fresh start, making clear plans for the future, and had received an official mental health evaluation just one day before her death, confirming she was emotionally stable. Does that sound anything like someone preparing to pull the trigger on themselves? On the morning of May 2nd, 2017, Tiffany made another entry in her personal journal. She wrote that she was doing everything she could to stay positive, hold on to her faith, keep moving forward, and figure out her next steps. She was preparing to leave that marriage, but the events of that day were about to unfold in a completely different direction. At around 4:30 that afternoon, Jason Crawford sat down at Tiffany's computer and began systematically going through her personal files and private messages. Before long, he found text conversations that clearly confirmed there was another man in her life. While Jason was reading those messages, Tiffany was nowhere near the house. She had dropped Tristan and Symphony off with a longtime friend, Caroline Gamble, then headed to a cosmetic appointment with another friend, Aaron Williams. After the appointment, the two women stopped to grab something to eat. Aaron encouraged Tiffany to be honest with her husband and finally start the divorce process. Neither of them realized there was no point in keeping the secret anymore. Her phone rang. It was Jason. He told her outright that he knew about the affair. Tiffany denied everything, insisted she had no idea what he was talking about, and quickly ended the call. But Jason kept digging through the hard drive, uncovering more and more details. At 6:30 p.m., he called again, this time confronting her with specific information. There was no way to deny it anymore. Tiffany admitted the affair. Jason immediately demanded that she come home. Right after that conversation, Tiffany called her mother, Sherry. She explained that Jason had found out everything and admitted she was under tremendous stress about seeing him in person. Sherry urged her daughter to be careful. Now let's take a closer look at what Jason was doing during those same minutes. He wasn't simply sitting in an empty house waiting for Tiffany to come home. He began calling everyone who might have known about the situation. His first call was to Kyle Sunday. As you might expect, Kyle didn't answer. Next, Jason called Caroline Gamble, the friend who was watching Tristan and Symphony. He asked her directly whether Tiffany had been involved with another man. Caroline confirmed that the relationship was real. There's one more important detail here that I think deserves attention. Jason's first marriage, to a woman named Christina Thomas, had also ended because of infidelity. During his conversation with Caroline, he openly said he had no intention of going through something like that a second time. Jason then called Tiffany 2 more times in a row. His message couldn't have been clearer. Pick up Tristan and Symphony immediately and come home. From that moment on, a face-to-face meeting between the two was unavoidable. On the morning of May 3rd, Sheriff Matt Gentry officially decided to hand the investigation over to Alabama State Agent Joe Parrish. The reason sounded perfectly reasonable. Jason's mother worked for the sheriff's office, so transferring the case would eliminate any potential conflict of interest. But do you see the contradiction? The local authorities suddenly became concerned about professional ethics only after they had already handed the keys to Tiffany's blood-covered SUV over to Jason's family the night before. Meanwhile, Jason's relatives gathered at the house. Even his first wife, Christina, came to support him, the same woman whose relationship with Jason had once ended over infidelity. She found the grieving widower in tears alongside his father, Chris, and his older son. Not long afterward, Jason made an unusual request. He asked his father to clean the inside of Tiffany's SUV. His explanation was emotional. He said every reminder of what had happened needed to be removed before Tristan and Symphony might accidentally see it. Christina decided to help her former father-in-law. Together, they grabbed water and cleaning supplies and personally scrubbed the primary crime scene. During that extensive cleanup, Chris came across something deeply disturbing. Several of Tiffany's teeth were lodged inside the vehicle's air conditioning vents. He also found her personal journal inside the SUV. As he carefully wiped blood from the dashboard, he stopped to read the final entries Tiffany had written. Around noon, a local officer finally called. State Agent Parrish was now requesting the SUV for forensic processing. By the time he arrived with an official search warrant, he was met with a vehicle that had been thoroughly cleaned. There wasn't a single visible bloodstain left inside. Jason's father simply handed investigators the teeth he had found, along with Tiffany's journal. It didn't take an experienced investigator long to realize that the most important piece of physical evidence had already been permanently compromised. Parrish immediately began reviewing everything that had happened the previous night. He listened to Jason's call to emergency services and watched the patrol officer's body camera footage. One detail immediately caught his attention. The caller's voice sounded unusually detached. Even more surprising, Jason never mentioned the affair or the heated confrontation that had unfolded earlier that evening when speaking with responding officers. But the most alarming discoveries came from the official reports. As Parrish reviewed the paperwork, he realized just how many critical steps had been missed. No one had tested Jason's hands for possible gunshot residue that night. Not a single officer thought to collect his clothing, so forensic specialists could examine it for biological evidence that wouldn't have been visible to the naked eye. What continues to amaze me is the enormous gap in logic behind the actions of the responding officers. Just look at the facts. Jason was the last known person with Tiffany before her death. The two had been involved in a serious confrontation that same evening. Yet from the moment deputies arrived, he was effectively treated as if he couldn't possibly be a suspect. How do you skip the most basic investigative steps? Was this a shocking level of incompetence? Or was someone deliberately protecting the son of a fellow employee? By the time State Agent Parrish took over, he had no choice but to rebuild the case using only the evidence the family hadn't already washed away. While Parrish focused on the suspicious events that unfolded during the first few hours after Tiffany's death, Dr. Valerie Green from the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences began her own examination. Her preliminary findings completely dismantled the original police theory. I want you to pay close attention to the medical evidence because hard science has a way of exposing false narratives better than almost anything else. After examining the wound to Tiffany's left temple, Dr. Green documented the complete absence of gunpowder particles and the lack of the characteristic burning around the entry wound. That allowed forensic specialists to reach a very specific conclusion. The muzzle of the revolver had been more than 10 inches away from her head when the shot was fired. Now think about the mechanics of that. Tiffany was seated in the driver's seat. Jason claimed he found her alone inside the locked SUV. How could someone physically extend a heavy revolver more than 10 inches away from their own head, using their non-dominant left hand inside the confined space of a vehicle, while still aiming accurately at their temple? There simply isn't enough room for that position to work, and the evidence doesn't stop there. When Green reviewed the crime scene photographs of the inside of the driver's door. She noticed something impossible to ignore. The plastic trim and the window were completely clean. Blood was found across the center console, the dashboard, and the passenger side floor, yet there wasn't a single visible drop on the driver's door. The bloodstain pattern pointed investigators toward one unavoidable conclusion. At the time the shots were fired, the driver's door had been standing open. There was another critical finding. Neither of Tiffany's gunshot wounds was classified as a contact wound. In cases involving self-inflicted gunshots, the barrel is typically pressed firmly against the skin, leaving distinctive soot deposits and other contact-related markings. Here, neither wound showed those characteristics. From a forensic standpoint, firing 2 non-contact shots into your own head is considered extraordinarily unlikely. The final piece came from firearms examiner Angela Fletcher, who analyzed the revolver itself. She discovered microscopic traces of DNA on both the trigger and the grip. There wasn't enough genetic material to identify a specific individual, but the biological markers clearly indicated that the DNA came from a male. At that point, the scientific picture began to come together. Someone appears to have been standing outside the open driver's door, fired from a distance, carefully wiped down the revolver, leaving behind only a minute trace of DNA, and then placed the firearm into Tiffany's left hand. After reviewing all of the forensic findings, the medical examiner officially changed the manner of death from a self-inflicted death to a homicide. For the first time, investigators had strong forensic grounds to take a much closer look at the man who had presented himself as the grieving widower from the very beginning. About a week after Tiffany's death, State Agent Joe Parrish sat down with Jason for their first official interview. Jason appeared calm and confident, and during that interview, he voluntarily shared one detail that ended up undermining the very scene investigators believe had been staged inside the SUV. On the record, Jason stated that Tiffany was absolutely not ambidextrous. In fact, he emphasized that she could barely perform precise or coordinated tasks with her left hand. Think about how remarkable that statement is. Jason himself confirmed that Tiffany was physically incapable of accurately handling a firearm with her non-dominant hand, even though that was the very hand where the heavy revolver had been found. Not long afterward, investigators scheduled a second interview. This time, the questioning was led by veteran investigator Jeff Rottenberg. Jason agreed to take a polygraph examination. During the test, the examiner documented physiological responses that were inconsistent with truthful answers. At the end of the examination, the polygraph examiner told Jason directly that the results were unfavorable and that he had not passed the test. Rottenberg immediately began asking more direct questions and increased the pressure. Jason's composure disappeared almost instantly. He abruptly ended the interview on his own, refused to continue, and walked out. While Jason was no longer cooperating, investigators received what would become one of the most significant witness statements in the entire case. It came from Logan, Jason's 14-year-old son from his first marriage. Logan had been awake that night. He clearly remembered hearing a lengthy argument between his father and Tiffany on the back porch. Pay close attention to the sequence of sounds he described, because the order matters. First, he heard the back door open and slam shut. Then, he heard the child safety gate open and close. Only after those sounds and the footsteps did the first gunshot ring out. Immediately afterward, he heard Tiffany scream. Only then did the second shot follow. That timeline is fundamentally inconsistent with the claim that Jason remained inside the house while Tiffany pulled the trigger herself. It took investigators nearly a full year to receive every final forensic report, including the delayed results from the state ballistics laboratory. Once the scientific evidence was assembled alongside Logan's testimony and the failed polygraph examination, investigators were ready to move forward. On May 17, 2018, 1 year after the events in the driveway, a Cullman County grand jury indicted Jason on a charge of intentional murder. 4 days later, on May 21st, he voluntarily turned himself in at the Cullman County Detention Center. At this point, you might think the case was finally over once Jason was arrested. It wasn't. He spent exactly 30 minutes behind bars. The court released him on a $100,000 property bond. His defense attorneys, Robert Tootin and Nicholas Weatherly, presented an argument that was difficult to overcome. There wasn't a single piece of direct biological evidence tying their client to the crime. No blood on his clothing. No gunshot residue collected from his hands. Nothing. And investigators had no effective response because those critical tests had never been performed. The first responding deputies had simply failed to preserve the evidence when they had the chance. So what most likely happened that night? Investigators had Logan's testimony, the forensic reports, and the ballistic evidence. When those pieces are put together, they form a remarkably clear reconstruction of the evening of May 2nd. No speculation, just the physical evidence and the sequence of events. Tiffany arrived home with Tristan and Symphony. Jason immediately took the two inside, got them ready for bed, and ordered Tiffany to remain outside. A long and emotional argument began on the back porch. It lasted for more than an hour. Jason told her she no longer had a place in that home. He openly confronted her about the affair and demanded that she remove her wedding ring. Realizing she wasn't going to be allowed back inside for the night, Tiffany asked him to at least bring out her work uniform for the following day's shift at the grocery store. He agreed. Jason stepped onto the porch, casually tossed the clothes toward her, and told her they had nothing left to discuss. According to his official account, he then walked back inside, shut the front door, and went into a secure room. But this is where Logan's timeline and the physical evidence completely challenged that version of events. Logan clearly remembered hearing the exterior door slam shut. Then he heard the child safety gate creak open and close. Those are the sounds of an adult walking away from the house and heading toward the driveway. Tiffany sat down in the driver's seat of her SUV. The driver's door remained wide open. She was crying with her head lowered. The revolver her father-in-law had given her for protection was still sitting inside the lower door pocket. According to investigators' reconstruction, Jason approached the SUV, calmly removed the revolver from the storage compartment, and pointed it at Tiffany. The first shot rang out. The bullet struck her cheek. Reacting instinctively, Tiffany threw up her left hand in an attempt to protect herself. Investigators believe that movement explains the abrasions later documented on her palm. A piercing scream followed. Moments later, the shooter stepped back slightly, adjusted the distance, and fired a second shot toward her temple. The moment everything went silent, investigators believe the staging began. The shooter quickly wiped the smooth metal surfaces of the revolver, removing as much trace evidence as possible. He then forced the firearm into Tiffany's left hand. After arranging the scene, he shut the driver's door, sealing the bloodstains inside the SUV and hiding them from anyone passing by. I've noticed something in cases like this over and over again. Even the most carefully planned cover-up can fall apart because of a mistake that lasts only a few seconds. After returning to the empty hallway, the widower called emergency services. Still running on adrenaline after staging the scene, he calmly walked the dispatcher through his version of events, completely convinced he had accounted for every detail and removed all suspicion from himself. The legal process dragged on for more than 5 years. It wasn't until November 2022 that the case finally went to trial. The defense centered its strategy on Tiffany's emotional state. Her attorneys argued that the end of her relationship with Kyle, combined with alcohol consumption, had driven her to take her own life. In an effort to strengthen his defense, Jason Crawford made a risky decision. He chose to testify. Taking the witness stand, he carefully described the argument that had taken place in the backyard that night. Then something happened that no one in the courtroom expected. While describing Tiffany sitting in the driver's seat with her head down, crying uncontrollably, Jason suddenly began laughing in front of the judge. When asked directly by his own attorney whether he found the tragedy amusing, he answered no. But what he said next stunned everyone in the courtroom. Jason admitted that, on that night, he wanted Tiffany to feel the same unbearable pain he believed she had caused him through her affair. At the same time, he continued to deny ever pulling the trigger. So what ultimately convinced the jury? At first, the jurors couldn't reach a unanimous decision. After nearly 2 hours of deliberation behind closed doors, they requested one specific piece of evidence: the recording of Jason's emergency call from the night Tiffany died. Again and again, they listened to one particular statement. Jason clearly told the dispatcher that the revolver was lying beside Tiffany's body on the seat. Then they compared those words with the crime scene photographs and the responding deputy's body camera footage. Those images showed something entirely different. The revolver was firmly positioned in Tiffany's left hand. That documented inconsistency, made during the very first minutes after the crime, shattered the credibility of Jason's account. On November 18, 2022, the jury returned its final verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. Jason was immediately placed in handcuffs and escorted out of the courtroom. On March 10, 2023, Judge Martha Williams imposed the sentence: 99 years in prison. Under Alabama law, he will not become eligible to request parole until he has served at least 15 years. But there's one final outcome in this case that I still struggle to understand. Tristan and Symphony were ultimately placed in the custody of their paternal grandparents, Chris and Rhonda. The very same people whose connections within local law enforcement complicated the investigation during its earliest hours, and whose own hands scrubbed Tiffany's blood from the plastic panels inside the SUV. Today, a purple wooden bench stands in a local park. Purple was Tiffany's favorite color. The bench serves as a safe place where anyone feeling alone can sit, talk with someone, or simply find support. In many ways, it continues the same idea Tiffany believed in years earlier, when she created a community dedicated to helping mothers support one another.